Welcome to MindStand Pod, a series exploring workplaces and diving into cultures that make them tick. Each of our seasons will dive into unique factors of business, provide great stories from leaders in human capital, and offer helpful insights you can use today to impact your company.
Hello there, Aubrey. Welcome to the MindStand Pod.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Really excited to have you here as well. Let's do a bit of backstory, how we're even able to connect together. You are a DEI champion, someone who respects and acknowledges how important it is to represent people of all different backgrounds. And it was a tweet that really caught our eye.
I love that. I'm such a Twitter human. But yeah, I feel really lucky for us to get connected. I think there's an obvious sort of shared passion around not only sort of creating fair, equitable, sort of safe spaces. I think MindStand is, really specialized in doing that in communities. And a lot of my work is around doing that within organizations. But I always feel really lucky to be connected with people that have that value set in what they're doing, because I think it can be rarer than I'd like to see. So I feel really honored to get to be in company with you.
Honored to have you. I say so often, there's so many different startups and different industries. When you think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has to be collaborative. Everyone's different, everyone has unique stories, so never choose one off the shelf solution to solve complex problems. And that's exactly some of the work that, you focused your career and life goals towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be honest, I got into DEI a little bit by accident. So it's coming up on 10 years ago now. So I'm doing it on purpose now. But at the beginning, I was really just motivated to solve my own problem. So I had sort of a research and communications background, and as a queer, mixed race, Latina, disabled woman, I encountered the tech industry in a very different way than a cishet white man would. And I kind of raised my hand and said, these things are problems. And I was told, you fix them. And so I said, okay, why not? Which I'm curious about your story and how you became sort of focused on this problem. Was it a personal experience? Was it just you got obsessed with the problem? What drove you to drive MindStand in this direction?
Yeah. This is a story I love sharing. A very personal story that really led me to co-found MindStand. And I'd love to share it with the listeners. About in 2017, Michael, the same person on this podcast, was a 17-year-old college student that got his first ever college internship. I was the only man of color, only person of color selected out of my entire university to work at this Fortune 10 company. I still remember this was earlier in the semester. I was invited to the Career Counseling Center. And as soon as I stepped in, I heard claps from, head of talent and recruitment. So I felt as though, I'm doing the right things. For so many Gen Z, millennial, anyone in the workforce, you want to work at a company where you feel comfortable, where you feel respected. And I felt that. I'm working in this engineering firm, and things are going so well. Learning the culture, the tools, just what it means to be a productive person in the company. And I can tell you, getting paid $20 an hour as a 17-year-old, I was living life. And things were going so well until about 3 weeks into the program. Same energy, same grit. I came into work with a bit of a different appearance. So rather than my typical button-up shirt and glasses, I came into work with a polo shirt and khakis. Mind you, the dress code there was t-shirt and jeans for most engineers. But I remember sitting down that day around lunch hour, and my supervisor, mind you, who's also a hiring manager, came up to me. There's a 30 to 40 year age difference between me and him. He's joked before about just trying to connect, but what he said in that moment really changed everything for me, set me on my journey. He said, "Hey, Michael, I almost didn't recognize you there. I thought you were like a thug or something." Yeah, couldn't even imagine how to respond just in that moment. So I didn't say anything. And Aubrey, you've spoken and you've been so vocal at, being able to be open, being able to share your perspectives and have that influence the culture and the heartbeat of organizations. What I saw was, for me, a 17-year-old person of color in a white dominated industry, there was little to no way for me to tell an HR manager, tell a CEO, and just let this interaction be a point of learning. I would either be in a room with the supervisor for conflict mitigation strategies, or I could have told a reporter, and that would have reflected, as we see every week with headlines on lack of inclusion. So having this such a raw, real experience in the workplace, I soon saw that there's a place to innovate, where you think of culture and how the water cooler, which was in person, which was the reaction that I had, has now permeated into online messaging, Slack, and just so many new and honestly exciting ways for us all to build community. I would like to take one step back and just highlight you and ask a couple of questions. So for the people here listening, Aubrey Blanche is the Senior Director of Equitable Design and Product and People at Culture Amp. Culture Amp is a company that's ballooned to over 700 exciting employees, consultants, designers, and leaders focused on this topic of employee experience. You've mentioned before, you found a role where you can work directly with leadership to ensure that people and purpose are tied into the vision. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Oh, thank you for having me. And thank you for sharing your story. It takes incredible courage and vulnerability to do that. But it also, I think, is just really incredible, like that you've turned that story, which could have ended in such a way, into something so magnificent and powerful. I think that's incredible.
Yeah. Thank you. And to just be a bit candid, that incident happened, if not 4 years ago now. I didn't feel comfortable sharing that story until 2020, because we saw such a big kind of racial conversation and movement. How have you, when you look at your career, your work, addressed the idea of inclusion, especially at a point of such emotional distress?
Yeah, I would say that 2020 was a really big turning point in the way that I was allowed to do my work. And I want to put some emphasis on that word allowed. So I started in Culture Amp in February 2020. And so came in right before, the video of George Floyd's murder went viral, and sort of there was a bigger corporate discussion about racial justice and sort of anti-Blackness in particular. And the reason I say allowed to do it was because my sort of theory of change, I believe that to do what we call DEI, or sort of like corporate social justice well, you have to start with tackling racism. Otherwise, you end up with what I call corporate white feminism, where it's like DEI for the rich cishet white ladies, which is not really solving a lot of structural oppression. And one of the things that I feel very grateful for now is that, that moment really galvanized the leadership at Culture Amp to think really critically about the way that they had invested in DEI up to that point, and really actually change the conversation for us internally. So, I was able to build a strategy that started with educating our, we are a white founded, white run organization from Australia. And so there was a big learning or knowledge gap for our leaders about what is anti-racism? Philosophically, they were like, of course we want to be anti-racist, but there was a big gap in, but what does that mean in our behaviors and our decisions day to day? And I think that the incredible work that activists did have really changed the conversation in ways that have created space for practitioners like me to change the agenda. And so going back to your really beautiful point about it takes everybody, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge, and Culture Amp has some new data out in our 2022 Workplace DEI report that shows that organizations in the work that Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate have done have actually driven targeted corporate investments that have changed the employee experience. And so I like to think that all I did was catch the football and keep things moving, but really want to make sure that credit is given to people who were creating that space, who were driving the agenda there. And so our DEI program, some of the biggest investments are around anti-racism coaching for our senior executives. And we provide an anti-racist management course for white managers of BIPOC employees. And we have dozens and dozens of people that go through that every year. And for us, that's because we say, as a company, our mission is to build a better world of work. And we don't just mean for white men. So that means we have to be really intentional about rooting that out. And the last piece I'll say, and then we'll get back to you, is I'd really encourage folks to hold us accountable for what we're talking about there. So we recently put out our 2021 Equitable Design and Impact report. And so, Culture Amp, like many companies, made some pretty big anti-racism commitments in summer 2020. But we're sitting at, this reflects December 2021, that report, we now have greater than population level representation of BIPOC employees and greater than population level representation of Black employees. And we're still closing some gaps in management and in senior leadership, but we also released that we have explicit company level goals around that for this year. So certainly we're not there yet, and no one needs to be patting us on the back. But I think that what we hope to do and what has helped us in building trust with our campers, that's what we call our employees, is they see that there's a lot of strategic investment and that there is progress that's being made that they get to share in and they get to see, and that they get to say, that's not good enough in certain places, and we respond to that.
I think such a critical point that you made was around response. It has to be intentional. It has to be data driven. The thing I hear so often, and I know our listeners can relate to this, is CEOs, corporate America, trying to debunk DEI. A topic, a podcast in and of itself, the idea that DEI can be hacked or put together and scaled up. And what's happened is we're looking at 2022. I highly recommend everyone here to read the data insight report that Culture Amp has created. So many CEOs are questioning, is DEI effective? What progress or measures that have we put in place in order to measure this change or this report that we created in the beginning of 2020? And a lot of what we're doing at MindStand is focused on that specific problem. But really what you said is you've been able to create initial initiatives. You're impelled by the works of so many social justice activists in the current climate to put something in action. And now there's a point of reevaluation and saying that we did this well, so let's grow on it. And we didn't do this well, but that's not the end of the world. We didn't fail our people. We're giving ourselves a new opportunity to show them why we're holding ourselves accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to loop back to something you said, because it's so good. I want to reinforce it. Is so often these corporate leaders say, is DEI effective? But data in the Culture Amp report, I'm all about the new data right now, shows that while 86% of companies believe that DEI is valuable, only 34% of practitioners say that they're properly resourced, and only 27% of practitioners say they understand how to measure the impact of their initiatives. And so I think it's actually kind of a bullshit question to ask whether DEI is effective, because if the mostly white dudes in power aren't properly resourcing it, how dare they try to hold the program to account for results? And so I think that's a really important distinction where, and our research also shows that the three things that most predict building a more diverse organization, you're not going to be shocked by this, are having DEI supportive policies, having a strategic plan in place, and using DEI data to make decisions. And the reason I want to draw 7 underlines under this is because those are exactly the same things that you need to drive literally any other business priority or program. And so I think it's really important for people in power, especially those from majority groups, to realize that the reason you haven't seen progress is because you have hamstrung this initiative by not resourcing it. Like, and the second thing is, like, we're not going to undo structural oppression on a quarterly QBR business cadence. Like, it took us decades and centuries to get here, but that doesn't mean that progress can't happen quarter over quarter. You know, a good example at Culture Amp is when we were running our data, found that campers with disabilities were not having the same experience as their non-disabled peers. And while, you know, that was a year-long initiative that we ran last year to improve that, we're not quite where we want to be with their experience, but we have seen quarter over quarter improvements in disabled employees who are saying, I see my next career step here. I intend to stay here. And so while the problem isn't solved on a quarter over quarter basis, what we can hold ourselves to account for is moving the needle forward. So I think that's really important, is that, like, asking whether DEI was effective, you first have to say, like, what were your specific goals? You know, in our case, our program is explicitly focused on BIPOC or racial equity and, you know, disability equity, because that's where we saw our largest gaps were. And so few companies are collecting data on this because they're, like, afraid to find out the problems. And I'm like, shouldn't you be more afraid of treating people inequitably? But so that's the thing, is, like, data gathering is the foundation of both being able to do something and holding yourself to account for progress, but also getting credit for progress. Like, it's okay to say, like, it's awesome that we moved forward, and also there's more progress that's needed. Like, those two things aren't in competition with each other.
It's people hear DEI and they don't understand it, so they assume it's going to be bad. They assume it's going to be, you know, an end result, a net negative, or, you know, a net neutral. You highlighted a great point there. When you work within Culture Amp, and just you as a practitioner in the DEI space, could you give some tangible wins, some tangible steps that companies can look towards accomplishing when they begin their DEI journey?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that companies can do, and I think this is the foundation of why Culture Amp has been able to move forward on our goals, is the leadership team needs to get out of their own ignorance. So the fact is, like, leaders, because of the white supremacist patriarchal society that we live in, tend to be cis het white men who don't actually really understand the structural problems that exist for people not like them. And I don't think there's an excuse for that, but I'm willing to go with people on their learning journey. I think that's okay. But I think leaders need to take accountability for the fact that they need to become educated on these issues. Because what I see with a lot of DEI programs is that they, like, put the work on unpaid ERG leads while the senior leaders explicitly do things that dismantle all of those initiatives. And there's multiple reasons why that's bad, but I say the number one thing is that the leadership team has to truly invest in educating themselves. And, you know, if you're spending $200,000 on a corporate retreat, you have money to take an anti-racism course. Or, like, if you're buying beer for the offsite, guess what? That, like, you're not going through anti-racism training, but there's beer and wine. You're just saying alcohol over Black people, right? Which no one would say out loud, but that's what your actions and values are saying. And so that's my number one thing, is leaders have to get trained. And my second piece is you need to be collecting data and sharing that broadly with leadership. Without those two foundational pieces, I have not seen a program that has created sustainable change.
I like that again. In order to create sustainable change, starting with leadership when you think of training, don't start org-wide, or don't think that org-wide training has to be the first example. Start with leadership and then collecting DEI data. Do you think those are the two best ways, again, to see that sustainable change?
Yes, like, I see, and this is, so I'm a consultant in addition to being at Culture Amp, and I often have clients who will come to me and say, okay, well, we did unconscious bias training. And I would be like, you should have called me beforehand because I would have told you that's a waste of money. And so it's like, first of all, unconscious bias is literally an unconscious mental process. Like you can't train it out of people's brains. There are ways to reduce, the use of heuristic based biases in decisions, but like a 2-hour training is not that. And so I think like there are these best practices that people do in DEI, and a lot of them, going back to this idea that people aren't sure how to measure the effectiveness, they either haven't been empirically validated, the empirics are mixed, or in a lot of cases, what I see with my customers is they're not actually custom fit to the organization. So people will say, oh, we're giving unconscious bias to all our people, training to our people managers. And I'm like, well, have you validated that you have issues with performance and promotional equity? Like, have you audited the process to see if that's the problem before you deployed a solution? Because the problem could be that you don't have enough representation in senior leadership. So it's not a problem of people having bias, it's a problem of your recruiting being busted. Or maybe the problem is that BIPOC folks are spending more time at each level than their white peers. That requires a different solution. And so what I always say to people is, if you're not collecting data on for your DEI program, you're definitely doing something wrong, but I can't tell you what it is. And so again, I know you've heard me say it a million times, but like collecting data is the most powerful thing you can do because it maximizes the chances that the investments you're making actually create change that is relevant to your company or your organization.
And is there a company too small to begin collecting DEI data?
I don't think so. I mean, it's super, super important to like let people know that like providing your demographics is optional and you will keep that data safe, right? Because it's often a huge risk, especially for minoritized people, to provide that data. But I would argue that even though, let's say you're a 10-person company, hold yourself to account for looking like the world. Yes, maybe that's adding one more person to your team, but if you build that muscle early, you will take on less what we call diversity debt. So this was a concept coined by Andrea Barica, who is brilliant, who was an investor at 500 startups and now is the CEO of a company called O School. But she talked about this idea of diversity debt. And so the earlier you build the muscle around learning about inclusion, say, so maybe your team meeting, everyone is on a rotation to assign an article about inclusion. So you're just spending 15 minutes, once a week learning about it. That's great. If you're a team of 5 or a team of 10, maybe that's the ask. When you get to be a big company, it's about auditing your performance review system and your promotions. But I think it's important to always take in this idea of everyone can do something, and the something looks different depending on your job, but the point is everyone's responsible for that. And that's really my theory of change I call equitable design, not DEI. And the concept of equitable design is like we each can design our roles in a way to create equity in our area of responsibility. So recruiting, maybe that's about sourcing and designing objective interviews. As the CEO, it's giving time and resources to it. As, maybe as that frontline, Black woman salesperson, it's about making sure you're taking care of yourself and building yourself a community of support, right? That's a radical act of resistance. But really finding value and responsibility that each of us have a role to play in changing the world. And it doesn't always have to be the biggest things, but it has to be something every day.
Hope, these past couple minutes, 15, 20 minutes of conversation can help at least let people make sense of this DEI journey. We're seeing turnover at a record number. A statistic I recently learned is that on average, the tenure for a head of DEI, so DEI officer, VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is 18 months. And that's usually the first thing a lot of organizations do when they say, let's start on a DEI journey. Let's start on our DEI journey. I need to hire someone outside of me to start it for me. But what we're talking about is the data, the intentional opportunities you have in order to gauge and measure company culture, and your employees 100% notice. They know when you're taking these steps to ask them at 4:30 to spend from 4:45 to 5 p.m. for a quick conversation. They notice when you send a new email because there's typos in your initial DEI survey, and they respect it. They're looking at you as human beings. And that's something that's gone so missing from this new and growing remote culture. How can you show? A thing I love saying is that DEI technology creates the intentionality that your employees are looking for when they work for you. And that feeds into a lot of the performance goals, double bottom line, ESG products that you love, that companies want to be able to share, because your employees are looking at you, competition, and potential hires are all looking at these things you do to build and create culture. Thank you.
I don't know if people can see me. I was just nodding the whole time. There was so much brilliance in that one clip. But I think it's right. I think it's, in many cases, I don't think that companies should just get credit for intentionality, but I think intentionality is important, right? I think it's about intentionality and accountability. And you can have both. And to just, really back up what you're saying is that customers, candidates, employees aren't looking for perfection, they're looking for progress. And so I think that's one of the things is we're seeing is that, especially for millennials and Gen Z, they're increasingly wanting to work at companies that align to their values, that have positive social impact. And so I would also say that we're kind of past the point where we need to convince leaders that this is valuable. I would actually make the argument that if you don't understand why it's valuable, you're not qualified to be leading a company. Right? Like, it should just be a job level qualification at this point, in the same way that you understand how to write a budget. And so,
report how to win friends and influence people has been out for decades now. Employee or emotional empathy has now been such a huge topic. Yeah, now's the time. Now's the time to take that stance.
Absolutely. And again, I go back to this idea, and folks can read more deeply into the Culture and Workplace DEI report. But what our research shows is that it's the same types of things that drive forward this initiative as drive forward other things. So what that says is, and I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it is simple. In that a lot of the solutions are known, and this isn't an issue of will, not an issue of capability to get started, which I think is really exciting, because it means that every company can take can take steps to make progress. And I mean, we're seeing more chief diversity officers hired. Like, there's still potential for progress, but ultimately we're not going to get there if we don't see more courageous leadership from companies.
Absolutely. And it's unique how we're both in a position to push leaders, to push employees, friends, and colleagues towards beginning and really holding accountable in their DEI journey. I'd love to go a bit into the micro of the macro topic. Aubrey, what does your day-to-day look like?
Oh, my day-to-day, it's a little bit of like a jumble every day. So as you said at the beginning, I look after our DEI strategy, both from a cultural transformation perspective, but also looking at the way that we provide DEI support from a customer perspective, and then also help the product team think about how we enable equity and inclusion for our customers with our tech products. So my day might start out with, this week, a press interview about the new data that we've released, and then jumping into an all sort of HR team meeting, maybe a couple of coaching conversations with leaders who are looking to advance on their journey, a one-on-one with folks on my team. A little bit later today, I'll be jumping into we have a tiger team in sales that sort of drives energy and education around DEI for our sales team. So I get to touch a little bit of everything, but the coolest part of my job, to be totally honest, is because I work with so many different people across the business, I get to learn from all of these brilliant people all day that are like I'm like, hey, we should talk about DEI. And then they bring their brilliance and make it 25 times better than anything I thought was possible. So I always think of myself in such a privileged position because I get to continue learning and I get to see ways that I can be better and show up better basically all day.
You've touched on such key factors of being an influential and important leader within your organization, leading people, leading inclusion. I'd like to highlight on that idea of inclusion. Not only are you looking at it from an external standpoint of how to ensure customers understand inclusion, but you're enacting it on a day-to-day basis. What superpower would you say you have when you're working within an organization focused on DEI?
Oh, that's such an insightful question. I think one of my superpowers comes from like the kind of funky identities that I have. So as you can see, because we're on video, like I'm mixed race but white assumed, my disabilities are invisible. I'm queer, but like that's kind of hard to like see. And so I have experiences on both sides of the marginalization line where I know what it's like to be treated like someone from a majority group, but I also know what it's like to be from a marginalized group. And I think that that particular perspective means that I can show up as a better partner for a broader variety of people because I can empathize or I have access to different life experiences that I think anybody who has any of those mixed or liminal identities would also relate to. But I think for me, that's the thing that I hope that I bring to the work is that I can make people feel seen and supported no matter which identity they come from, even though there's obviously a lot of identities that like I don't have any lived experience with, and I don't want to be arrogant enough to think that I know what that life feels like. But I can usually take something from my experience and get to at least a little bit of understanding. So that for me is something I think that helps me in my work in order to help people either feel more confident or to drive them forward on their inclusion journeys. Yeah.
Amazing. Kind of knowing that split, knowing that opportunity between empathy and sympathy, how to offer both, how to really stand up and speak for others. And again, it really sounds like the key word of our conversation has been around accountability. Thank you. Aubrey, this has been an amazing conversation. For those here, I highly encourage you to follow Aubrey on Twitter. Would you like to just drop your Twitter handle?
Sure. Yeah, I'm at A.D. Blanche. That's BLANCHE. That's my digital soapbox. You can also check out a lot of the resources from Culture Amp there, but I also would suggest that you check out the MindStand on Twitter, on LinkedIn, all of that. They're one of my fave follows.
Thank you. Thank you. That recent thread you had just talking about the idea of an invisible disability and just being candid. It's so often in the goal of this show is to highlight, people of unique perspectives and what impels them and brings them to the workplace. Aubrey, this has been an amazing conversation. You highlighted Twitter and the website, but what's another way for people to get in contact with you? What question should people come to you with?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is just aubreyblanche.com, and you go to the contact form, you can shoot me an email right there. But I would say folks who are looking for support on their DEI journeys, I do a lot of coaching for leaders, but also work with companies sort of one-on-one to help them craft their strategies. So I just love the opportunity to help, people and companies, what I think of as be the best versions of themselves.
Aiden. Thank you. Last question. Do you know one or two people that would love, based on our conversation, to jump on the MindStand Pod?
All right. So I'm going to give you people that I think you should be following, and then I will try to get them on the pod for you. So Katrina Jones, who has tons of DEI experience. She's a consultant, and she is just one of the most connected, aware people. I learn things from her all the time. And then another person who is both a CEO and an activist that I really suggest that folks follow is Meijen Kim. So she wrote a book called The Wake Up last year, which is about really aligning your intentions with your impact. And I think both of those folks are just incredibly brilliant thinkers and people that I feel like grateful to even get the chance to learn from.
Yeah. Our goal is to really bring resources, as well to the conversation. And those are two amazing people I look forward to connecting with. Oh, thank you, Aubrey. Thank you for joining the MindStand Pod, and just thank you for sharing your perspectives.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be even in the company of folks like you. So I'm really, really grateful for it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. This was a great conversation.